There exists a moment in every person's life when someone crosses a line, when disrespect lands like a slap across the face and the world seems to pause, waiting to see what happens next. In that suspended second, most people have been taught to take the high road, to turn the other cheek, to let it slide, because responding would make them just as bad as the offender. But what if that teaching, however noble it sounds, is actually a carefully constructed trap that transforms you into prey? What if the very advice meant to make you virtuous is quietly eroding your power, your reputation, and your ability to command respect in a world that respects only strength? Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat who witnessed the brutal mechanics of power in Renaissance Italy, understood something that modern sensibilities have forgotten. He observed princes rise and fall, watched as men of principle were destroyed by those without scruples, and documented the harsh truth that the world is not governed by what should be, but by what is. In his observations, he noticed a pattern that recurs throughout history with mathematical precision. Those who ignore disrespect do not rise above it, they sink beneath it. The aggressor does not reflect on their behavior and feel shame. They smell weakness and press harder. The observers do not admire the victim's restraint. They make mental notes about who can be pushed and who cannot. When someone disrespects you publicly and you respond with silence, you are not demonstrating maturity or emotional intelligence. You are broadcasting a message to everyone watching that you can be treated this way without consequence, that your boundaries are suggestions rather than walls, that your presence commands no fear and therefore deserves no respect. Machiavelli knew that in the theater of human interaction, perception creates reality, and the perception of weakness invites aggression the way blood in the water summons sharks. He did not arrive at this conclusion through cynicism, but through careful observation of how power actually functions when stripped of comfortable illusions. The dangerous alternative that Machiavelli proposed is not mindless retaliation or emotional reactivity, but something far more calculated and devastating. It is a strategic response that demonstrates you understand the rules of the game being played, that you possess both the will and the capacity to impose costs on those who transgress against you, and that disrespecting you is not a free action, but an expensive mistake. This approach requires neither anger nor hatred, only clarity about what behavior you will tolerate, and the discipline to enforce your boundaries with precision. It demands that you see the world as it is rather than as you wish it were, and that you act accordingly. What follows is not a call to become cruel or vindictive, but an invitation to understand the mechanics of respect and power that govern human relationships, whether we acknowledge them or not. Machiavelli's wisdom, forged in the fires of Renaissance political warfare, offers a framework for navigating disrespect that protects your standing, maintains your authority, and ensures that those who cross you once will think carefully before attempting it again. The question is not whether you will face disrespect, because you will, but whether you will respond in a way that diminishes you or defines you as someone who cannot be trifled with. The choice, as always, belongs to you, but the consequences of that choice will echo far beyond the moment itself. The first principle that Machiavelli would insist upon is the recognition that human beings are not primarily rational creatures guided by fairness and reciprocity, but rather opportunistic beings who constantly test boundaries to determine what they can get away with. This is not pessimism, but realism born from watching how people actually behave when they believe actions carry no consequences. In every social hierarchy, from the playground to the boardroom, there exists a continuous process of boundary testing where individuals probe to see who will defend their territory and who will surrender it without a fight. Those who consistently fail to defend themselves become marked in the collective consciousness as safe targets. people whose goodwill can be exploited and whose resources can be extracted without fear of reprisal. When you ignore disrespect, you are participating in this boundary testing process by providing the answer the aggressor sought. You are confirming that you either lack the awareness to recognize the transgression, lack the courage to address it, or lack the power to do anything about it. Each of these interpretations damages your standing, but perhaps most dangerous is that your inaction teaches not just the original offender, but everyone who witnessed the exchange. Human beings are intensely social creatures who learn by observation, and they are constantly updating their internal models of who holds power and who does not. Your response to disrespect becomes data that others use to calibrate their own behavior toward you. Machiavelli observed that in the political realm, small offenses left unaddressed inevitably grow into larger ones, not because offenders become emboldened by success, but because they accurately perceive that the victim has revealed themselves as someone who will not enforce consequences. This pattern repeats itself with depressing regularity throughout history. A minor slight is ignored in the name of being the bigger person, and the offender interprets this as permission to escalate. What began as a dismissive comment becomes open mockery. What started as a small boundary violation becomes brazen exploitation. And what should have been nipped in the bud becomes a pattern of systematic disrespect that others begin to imitate because they see it works. The psychology underlying this dynamic is straightforward. When someone tests you with disrespect and you do not respond, they experience relief rather than guilt. They learn that you are safe, that they can express their hostility or assert their dominance without paying a price. This relief is pleasurable, and pleasure reinforces behavior, which means they will almost certainly repeat the action and likely escalate it to see how far they can push. Meanwhile, observers are making their own calculations. They note who responded to challenges and who absorbed them, who commanded respect through their reactions and who invited further disrespect through their passivity. These observations shape their future interactions with you in ways you may never fully recognize, but will certainly experience. Machiavelli's insight cuts deeper still. He understood that the person who disrespects you is often not your primary concern, but rather the audience that witnesses the exchange. In the court politics of Renaissance Italy, a prince who allowed himself to be publicly insulted without response would soon find his authority questioned by those who previously feared him. The insult itself mattered less than the prince's reaction to it, because that reaction signaled whether he retained the will and capacity to punish transgressions. The same dynamic operates in modern contexts with identical precision. Your co-worker who witnesses your boss belittle you and sees you smile and take it will adjust their perception of your authority. Your friend who watches someone mock you and sees you laugh it off will recalibrate their assessment of your boundaries. The trap that ensnares so many well-intentioned people is the belief that rising above disrespect means ignoring it. That true strength lies in the ability to absorb offense without reaction. This belief confuses emotional regulation with strategic passivity, wisdom with weakness, and patience with permission. True strength is not the absence of response, but the presence of choice. It is the capacity to recognize when responding serves your interests and when it does not, rather than having a default setting of always absorbing disrespect regardless of context. Machiavelli would argue that the person who cannot respond to disrespect is not strong but helpless, and there is no virtue in helplessness, only vulnerability. What makes this dynamic particularly insidious is that the damage accumulates gradually enough that many people do not recognize what is happening until their position has severely eroded. The first instance of disrespect ignored seems trivial, hardly worth making an issue over. The second feels like just another minor thing that a secure person would brush off. By the 10th or 20th instance, a pattern has been established. a reputation has formed, and reversing it requires far more energy and conflict than addressing it at the outset would have demanded. Machiavelli knew that in matters of power and respect, prevention is infinitely easier than cure, and the time to establish boundaries is at the first transgression, not after they have been repeatedly violated with impunity. The alternative that Machiavelli would advocate is not impulsive retaliation driven by wounded ego, but rather calculated response designed to impose costs and establish deterrence. This distinction is crucial because it separates the reactive behavior of someone controlled by their emotions from the strategic action of someone who understands how to shape others' behavior through consequences. When disrespect occurs, the question is not whether your feelings were hurt, but whether allowing the behavior to stand unpunished serves your long-term interests in maintaining your position and authority. If it does not, and it rarely does, then a response becomes necessary not as emotional satisfaction, but as strategic investment in your future treatment. The form this response takes will vary dramatically based on context, but certain principles remain constant. First, the response must be proportional enough to be taken seriously, but not so excessive that it makes you appear unhinged or vindictive. Machiavelli counseled that punishment should fit the crime precisely because disproportionate responses damage your reputation as someone with sound judgment. If someone makes a dismissive comment and you declare war, observers will question your stability. If someone makes a dismissive comment and you calmly but firmly address it in a way that makes them uncomfortable and establishes that such behavior carries costs, observers will respect your boundary enforcement. Second, the response should be swift enough that the connection between transgression and consequence remains clear to all observers. Delayed responses lose their deterrent value because the audience has moved on and no longer connects your action to the original offense. When disrespect occurs and is immediately met with consequence, everyone understands the causal relationship. The offender cannot pretend they do not know why they are experiencing negative outcomes, and observers cannot dismiss your action as unprovoked aggression. Timing transforms response from petty vengeance into clear boundary enforcement. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the response must actually impose costs that the offender cares about. This requires understanding what the person values and ensuring that their disrespect results in losing access to something they want. If the offender seeks your approval or cooperation, withdrawal of those things creates consequences. If they seek status in a shared social group, your response might involve reducing that status through strategic information sharing or exclusion from opportunities. If they seek professional advancement and depend on your input, your response might involve honest but damaging feedback delivered to relevant decision makers. Machiavelli understood that consequences must be felt, not merely symbolic, or they teach nothing. The genius of this approach is that it operates through revealed preference rather than spoken threats. You are not announcing what you will do if disrespected. You are simply doing it when disrespect occurs. This avoids the trap of making threats you may not be able to enforce while still clearly demonstrating that actions have consequences. After the first person discovers that disrespecting you is expensive, word spreads through observation rather than proclamation. Others notice that those who cross you seem to experience unfortunate difficulties, that opportunities dry up for them, that you become unavailable when they need something, that their social standing somehow diminishes in ways that seem connected to how they treated you. Machiavelli would emphasize that this system works because it aligns with how human beings actually learn and modify behavior. We are not primarily persuaded by arguments or inspired by examples of forgiveness. We are trained by the consequences we experience and observe. When a behavior consistently produces negative outcomes, we abandon it not because we have grown morally, but because we have learned strategically. The person who disrespects you and experiences tangible costs will think twice before doing so again, not because they respect you more as a human being, but because they have learned that you are someone whose boundaries are enforced and whose displeasure is expensive. This is not cruelty, but clarity. It is not vengeance, but communication through the language of consequences that human beings understand far better than the language of virtue and principle. You are not trying to hurt people for the sake of hurting them. You are trying to shape their future behavior by making clear what actions will and will not be tolerated. In doing so, you create a protective barrier around yourself that most potential offenders will not breach because the price of doing so has been clearly established through your past responses. Those who do breach it anyway have revealed themselves as either too foolish or too hostile to coexist with peacefully, and your response can escalate accordingly with full justification. One of the most profound aspects of Machiavelli's thought is his insistence that you must be feared before you can be loved, and that if you must choose between the two, fear provides far more reliable protection. This sounds harsh to modern ears, trained on narratives where kindness conquers all, but Machiavelli was not writing fairy tales. He was documenting the mechanics of power as they actually operate. Fear in this context does not mean terror or cruelty, but rather the understanding that crossing you carries predictable and unpleasant consequences. It means that people who consider disrespecting you automatically factor in the costs of doing so, and frequently decide those costs are too high to justify the momentary satisfaction. When you ignore disrespect, you are actively choosing not to be feared. And in making that choice, you are surrendering one of the most effective tools for ensuring respectful treatment. People who do not fear any consequence from you have no external reason to regulate their behavior toward you. They might still treat you well if they like you, but that goodwill is fragile and depends entirely on their mood, their circumstances, and whether someone else offers them a better option. Fear, by contrast, is stable and reliable precisely because it is based not on fluctuating emotions, but on consistent consequences. The person who fears disrespecting you will maintain respectful behavior even when they dislike you, even when it is inconvenient, even when they would prefer to act otherwise. This principle operates at every level of human interaction. The employee who knows their manager will not tolerate disrespect and has seen others face consequences for it, will regulate their behavior accordingly regardless of their personal feelings. The friend who understands that you will withdraw from the relationship if they treat you poorly will maintain boundaries that protect the friendship. The romantic partner who knows you will leave rather than accept mistreatment will think carefully before crossing lines. In each case, the fear of consequence shapes behavior in ways that appeals to better nature simply cannot match. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly in politics, but it applies with equal force in personal relationships, professional environments, and every other domain where human beings interact. The objection that immediately arises is that relationships based on fear are somehow inauthentic or unsatisfying, that we should want people to treat us well because they value us, not because they fear consequences. This objection reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and the complexity of motivation. People rarely act from single motivations. The same individual who values you and wants to treat you well will still sometimes be tempted to transgress when tired, frustrated, or presented with personal advantage. The fear of consequences does not replace genuine affection or respect. It provides a floor beneath which behavior cannot fall, even when higher motivations temporarily fail. It is the safety net that catches relationships when goodwill alone proves insufficient. Moreover, the dynamic between fear and love is not oppositional, but complementary in Machiavelli's framework. Once fear establishes that you cannot be disrespected with impunity, space opens for genuine affection and respect to develop because people know where the boundaries are and feel secure within them. Paradoxically, relationships with clear and enforced boundaries often become warmer and more authentic than those where people must constantly guess what is acceptable. When everyone knows that certain behaviors will trigger certain responses, they can relax within those parameters rather than existing in permanent uncertainty about whether today is the day you finally address accumulated grievances. Machiavelli's insistence on fear also connects to his broader understanding of human psychology. He believed that people are generally risk-averse when consequences are clear and immediate. Given the choice between a certain small cost now and a potential large benefit later, most will choose to avoid the certain cost. This is why enforced boundaries work so effectively. The person considering whether to disrespect you sees the certain consequence of your response and weighs it against the uncertain benefit of whatever they would gain through the disrespect. If your track record shows that you reliably impose costs, the calculation favors respectful behavior. If your track record shows that you absorb disrespect without consequence, the calculation favors transgression. The practical application of this principle requires consistency above all else. Establishing fear, in the Machiavellian sense, means responding to boundary violations with predictable consequences every single time, not occasionally or when you feel like it. Inconsistent enforcement teaches people that they can gamble on your inaction, that sometimes they will get away with disrespect, and therefore it is worth trying. Consistent enforcement teaches that the consequences are inevitable, that disrespecting you is not a gamble but a guaranteed loss, and therefore it is never worth attempting. This consistency demands discipline and energy, which is why so many people default to ignoring disrespect, but the investment pays compounding dividends as your reputation for enforcing boundaries reduces the frequency with which those boundaries are tested. The next layer of Machiavelli's wisdom concerns the distinction between being good and appearing good, a distinction that proves crucial when addressing disrespect. He observed that those who are genuinely good in every situation without regard for consequences are quickly destroyed by those who are not good, because goodness without the capacity and willingness to defend itself becomes martyrdom. The successful prince must therefore cultivate the appearance of goodness while retaining the capacity for ruthlessness when circumstances demand it. Applied to disrespect, this means maintaining a generally pleasant and cooperative demeanor that makes your firm responses to boundary violations stand out as justified rather than characteristic. The person who is perpetually harsh and aggressive finds that when they respond forcefully to genuine disrespect, observers dismiss it as typical behavior from someone who is always looking for conflict. Their responses carry no special weight because they represent normal operating procedure rather than a departure from baseline. The person who is generally pleasant and reasonable but responds decisively to disrespect creates a powerful contrast. Observers think if even this reasonable person felt compelled to respond strongly, the offense must have been serious. Your baseline agreeability becomes the backdrop that makes your refusal to tolerate disrespect meaningful and legitimate rather than merely temperamental. This strategic use of contrast extends to how you frame your responses. Machiavelli would counsel against responding to disrespect with visible anger or emotional volatility, not because anger is wrong, but because it allows the offender and observers to reframe the situation as being about your overreaction rather than their transgression. When you respond with calm firmness, with clear articulation of what behavior was unacceptable and what consequence will follow, you maintain the frame that this is about enforcing reasonable boundaries rather than about your hurt feelings. The offender cannot redirect attention to your emotional state because you have not given them emotional display to redirect to. The art lies in responding with sufficient force to impose real costs while maintaining sufficient composure that your response appears measured and justified rather than excessive and emotional. This requires practice and self-awareness. You must be capable of recognizing when someone has crossed a line without waiting until accumulated frustration makes you explode disproportionately. You must be able to calculate what response serves your strategic interests rather than what response would feel most satisfying to your wounded ego. You must be willing to invest energy in crafting responses that achieve your objectives rather than simply reacting in the moment. Machiavelli understood that reputation is built through consistency between words and actions over time. If you say certain behaviors are unacceptable, but take no action when they occur, your words lose all meaning and you lose all credibility. If you respond to every minor irritation with nuclear options, you develop a reputation for instability that damages your standing. The path to maintaining respect lies in the middle, where your boundaries are clearly articulated through your responses, where consequences are proportional to offenses, and where your track record shows that you mean what you say and do what you promise. This consistency extends to following through completely on whatever consequence you impose. One of the fatal errors people make when they finally decide to respond to disrespect is announcing consequences they do not fully enforce. They tell someone they will no longer help them with projects, then make exceptions when asked nicely. They say they will exclude someone from social events, then invite them anyway to avoid awkwardness. They threaten to report behavior to management, then back down when the offender apologizes. Each of these failures to follow through teaches the same lesson as never responding at all. Your boundaries are not real. Your warnings are bluffing, and disrespecting you carries no lasting cost. Machiavelli would insist that half measures and partial enforcement are worse than no action at all because they reveal not just weakness, but inconsistency. The person who never responds at least appears to have chosen a coherent strategy of rising above conflict. The person who threatens consequences but does not deliver them appears to want to enforce boundaries but lacks the will to do so. And that appearance of weakness combined with desire for strength invites contempt. Once you commit to responding to disrespect, you must see that response through completely, or your position becomes weaker than it was before you attempted to address the situation. This is why careful calculation of what you are willing and able to enforce must precede any response. The strategic question that emerges is not whether to respond to disrespect, but how to calibrate your response to maximize deterrent effect while minimizing cost to yourself. Machiavelli excelled at this kind of calculation, always seeking the most efficient means to achieve desired ends. In the context of disrespect, efficiency means finding responses that impose meaningful costs on the offender while requiring minimal expenditure of your time, energy, and resources. The goal is not to hurt them as much as possible, but to shape their future behavior as effectively as possible with the least effort on your part. This often means that the most effective responses are not the most dramatic ones. Excluding someone from information they need to succeed at work requires only that you stop including them in communications, a passive action that costs you nothing but imposes real disadvantage on them. Withdrawing your willingness to help someone who depends on your expertise requires only that you become too busy when they ask. A simple boundary that protects your time while teaching them the value of treating you respectfully. Calmly sharing your perspective on someone's behavior with mutual contacts requires only a few honest conversations that plant seeds which grow into damaged reputation. Each of these responses is subtle, sustainable, and scalable in ways that dramatic confrontations are not. The beauty of these subtle responses is that they are difficult for the offender to publicly challenge without making themselves look worse. If you stop helping someone who's been treating you disrespectfully and they complain to others about it, they must explain why you stopped helping them, which requires admitting their prior behavior. If you exclude someone from opportunities and they protest, they must argue they are entitled to your support despite having shown you disrespect. In each case, the attempt to resist your response forces them to make visible the very behavior that justified it. This creates a self-reinforcing dynamic where their options for escaping consequences are limited by the same behavior patterns that led to consequences in the first place. Machiavelli also understood the importance of making examples that deter others without requiring you to punish everyone. When one person discovers that disrespecting you leads to tangible negative outcomes, and that discovery occurs in a context where others can observe it, you have achieved deterrence that extends far beyond the single individual you responded to. This is why responding to disrespect is more important when it occurs publicly than when it occurs privately. Private disrespect damages your relationship with one person. Public disrespect damages your reputation with everyone watching unless you respond in a way that demonstrates you will not tolerate such treatment. The calculation of when to respond must factor in this audience effect. A private slight might be addressed through private conversation or simply through adjusting how much effort you invest in that relationship. A public slight demands public consequence, not because your ego requires vindication, but because everyone who witnessed the disrespect is waiting to see what happens next, and your response or lack thereof will shape their future behavior toward you. The person who makes subordinates uncomfortable in one-on-one meetings is a problem. The person who disrespects you in front of colleagues or clients is a threat to your authority that must be addressed visibly enough that others learn from it. This brings us to another crucial element of Machiavelli's thought: the distinction between being actually powerful and being perceived as powerful. In matters of respect and disrespect, perception often matters more than reality, because most people will never test whether you can truly back up your boundaries. They will base their behavior on their assessment of whether you will enforce consequences, and that assessment is built from observations of how you have responded to others. The person who has never actually had to impose serious consequences, but who has clearly demonstrated willingness to do so in smaller matters, benefits from deterrence just as much as someone who has crushed major opponents. Your goal, therefore, is not to become someone who enjoys punishing transgressors or who seeks out conflict, but rather to become someone with a clear reputation for enforcing boundaries consistently. This reputation does the work of deterrence so that actual enforcement becomes progressively less necessary. The first few times you must respond to disrespect require energy and attention because you are establishing your patterns and teaching people what to expect. After those patterns are established, the mere existence of your track record prevents most potential transgressions before they occur. People self-regulate their behavior toward you because they know what happens when boundaries are crossed. This is the ultimate efficiency that Machiavelli sought, creating systems where the threat of consequence maintains order without requiring constant actual imposition of consequence. The prince who has demonstrated willingness to execute traitors rarely needs to execute anyone because the demonstration itself prevents treason. The person who has demonstrated willingness to impose costs on those who disrespect them rarely faces disrespect because the demonstration teaches everyone to regulate their behavior preemptively. In both cases, the initial investment in establishing credibility pays dividends in the form of reduced future conflict and easier maintenance of authority. One of the most sophisticated aspects of Machiavelli's analysis concerns the relationship between justice and power, a relationship that proves especially relevant when responding to disrespect. He observed that while people claim to value justice abstractly, they respect power concretely, and that claims of justice without power to enforce them are merely noise that others learn to ignore. Applied to disrespect, this means that appeals to fairness or expectations that others should recognize how they have wronged you are exercises in futility. What matters is not whether the disrespect was fair, but whether you will take action in response to it. The person who responds to disrespect by explaining why it was inappropriate or hurtful is engaging in a fundamentally weak strategy. They are appealing to the offender's sense of fairness or empathy, which assumes the offender possesses these qualities in sufficient measure to modify their behavior voluntarily. Machiavelli would point out that someone willing to disrespect you has already demonstrated either lack of empathy or lack of concern for fairness where you are involved, which means appealing to those qualities is unlikely to succeed. What they will understand is consequence. What will modify their behavior is experiencing tangible cost for their actions. This is not to say that communication has no place in addressing disrespect, but rather that communication divorced from consequence is impotent. The conversation where you explain that someone's behavior was unacceptable becomes meaningful only when paired with the demonstration that such behavior leads to outcomes they wish to avoid. Otherwise, you are simply sharing your feelings, which the offender may acknowledge to end the awkward conversation while changing nothing about their future behavior. Machiavelli's framework insists that behavior changes in response to altered incentives, not in response to altered understanding of how that behavior affects others. The trap here is that explaining your hurt or disappointment can actually weaken your position by revealing emotional vulnerability without establishing consequence. The offender learns that disrespecting you causes you pain but costs them nothing, which can paradoxically encourage further disrespect from those who enjoy wielding power over others. They have discovered a button they can push that reliably generates a reaction, and for some personality types, that discovery is irresistible. What you intended as boundary communication becomes entertainment or ammunition in future conflicts. Machiavelli would counsel a different approach. Demonstrate the consequence first, explain if you must second. When someone disrespects you, your immediate response should impose some cost, however small. Then, if you choose to explain your reasoning, you are doing so from a position where you have already shown capacity and willingness to act, which gives your words weight they would not otherwise possess. The offender is no longer listening to someone merely expressing hurt feelings, but to someone explaining why they just experienced negative consequences and outlining what additional consequences might follow if behavior does not change. This sequence also allows you to gauge the offender's receptiveness to change. If your explanation of how their behavior was inappropriate leads to genuine recognition and modification of future behavior, you have successfully addressed the situation with minimal escalation. If your explanation leads to defensiveness, deflection, or continued disrespect, you know that further communication is pointless and that your response must be purely consequence-based. Either way, you have not wasted energy on extended attempts to make someone understand who lacks the willingness or capacity to do so. The deeper insight is that respect cannot be negotiated or requested. It can only be commanded through demonstrated consequences for disrespect. When you ask someone to respect you, you are implicitly acknowledging that you lack the power to compel respect, which undermines the very thing you are seeking. When you simply respond to disrespect with appropriate consequences without asking for anything, you are demonstrating power rather than requesting it. And that demonstration often generates respect, where requests would generate only contempt or pity. The final dimension of Machiavelli's approach to disrespect concerns the long-term cultivation of relationships and alliances that reinforce your position. He understood that individual capacity for response, however strong, is multiplied exponentially when supported by networks of people who have aligned interests in maintaining certain standards of behavior. In modern contexts, this means that part of responding to disrespect involves ensuring that others who witnessed it or who have relationships with both parties understand your perspective and see the reasonableness of your response. This is not about gossip or vindictive bad-mouthing, but rather about strategic information sharing that shapes the narrative around events. When someone disrespects you and you respond with consequences, the offender will almost certainly attempt to frame your response as overreaction, pettiness, or unreasonable behavior. If they succeed in establishing that narrative with mutual contacts, your response may damage your reputation more than their original disrespect did. Your task is to ensure that your version of events, the one where you set reasonable boundaries and enforce them after they were violated, becomes the dominant understanding of what occurred. This requires some finesse. Directly attacking the offender's character or obsessively discussing the situation makes you appear petty and preoccupied. Simply mentioning, when relevant, that you are no longer working with or supporting someone because of how they treated you, and providing a factual account when pressed for details, allows others to draw their own conclusions about who behaved appropriately. The key is providing information without appearing to seek sympathy or validation, framing your response as a practical decision about who you invest time and energy in, rather than as emotional retaliation. Machiavelli would recognize this as essential reputation management. Your value in social and professional networks partly derives from others' assessment of whether you are someone who maintains appropriate standards and boundaries, or someone who either causes unnecessary drama or allows themselves to be walked over. By ensuring that observers understand you responded to genuine transgression rather than imagined slight, and that your response was proportional rather than excessive, you strengthen your reputation as someone who is reasonable but firm, pleasant but not pushover. This network effect also creates additional consequences for the offender beyond those you impose directly. When mutual contacts understand that someone disrespected you and you responded appropriately, many will adjust their own treatment of that person downward. Not because you ask them to, but because people naturally distance themselves from those who demonstrate poor judgment and boundary violations. The offender may find that opportunities dry up, that people are less willing to help them, that their own reputation suffers in subtle ways that seem disconnected from their disrespect of you, but are actually direct consequences of it. Moreover, your response to disrespect and your management of its aftermath sends signals to everyone in your network about what standards you maintain and what behavior you will accept. This has deterrent effects far beyond the single individual you responded to. Others who might have considered similar behavior see what happened and recalculate whether transgressing against you is worth the costs. Those who value your respect and want to maintain good relationships with you take note of where boundaries lie and ensure they do not cross them. Your network becomes progressively more populated by people who treat you well and progressively less populated by those who do not. Not through constant conflict, but through natural selection driven by your consistent enforcement of standards. The truly sophisticated player in Machiavelli's framework understands that every response to disrespect is simultaneously addressing the immediate situation and teaching everyone who observes it about what behavior will and will not be tolerated. This dual function means that even situations where the specific offender matters little to you have value in establishing precedent and deterring others. The junior colleague who disrespects you may be irrelevant to your career, but your response to them teaches your peers what they can expect, if they cross similar lines. The acquaintance who violates social boundaries matters less than the message your response sends to friends about what kind of treatment you accept. This long-term, network-aware approach to addressing disrespect transforms isolated incidents into data points in an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining your position within various social hierarchies. Each response contributes to a pattern that others learn to recognize and respect. Over time, as that pattern becomes established, you find that you face less disrespect, not because people have become more virtuous, but because they have learned that disrespecting you is expensive and that easier targets exist elsewhere. You have created a protective barrier, not through aggression or hostility, but through consistent enforcement of boundaries that teaches others to regulate their behavior toward you preemptively, which is the ultimate goal of any strategic response to disrespect in the first place. The wisdom that Machiavelli offers cuts against the comfortable narratives we prefer to believe about human nature and moral behavior, but it possesses the uncomfortable virtue of corresponding to how the world actually operates when stripped of wishful thinking. Ignoring disrespect is not the high road, but the path of least resistance. And while resistance requires energy and carries risks, so does the progressive erosion of your standing that occurs when boundaries go unenforced. The choice is not between conflict and peace, but between addressing conflict when it is small and manageable, or waiting until it has grown large and potentially overwhelming. Every instance of disrespect left unaddressed is a brick removed from the wall that protects your dignity and position. And eventually, that wall collapses entirely. What Machiavelli understood, and what modern sensibilities often reject, is that the world respects strength more than virtue, that fear provides more reliable protection than love, and that power, without the willingness to use it, is merely impotence dressed in noble language. This does not mean you must become cruel or that kindness has no place in human relations, but rather that kindness without clear boundaries and enforced consequences becomes an invitation to exploitation. The truly wise individual cultivates both the capacity for warmth and the capacity for ruthlessness, deploying each as circumstances require rather than rigidly committing to one mode regardless of how others behave. The alternative Machiavelli offers is dangerous only to those who threaten you, disrespect you, or cross boundaries you have clearly established. For everyone else, your willingness to impose consequences creates a clarity and security that makes relationships easier rather than harder. People know where they stand with you, know what behavior will maintain your goodwill and what behavior will forfeit it, and can regulate themselves accordingly. This transparency, backed by consistent enforcement, creates an environment where most people treat you well, not because they are good, but because the structure of consequences you have established makes treating you well the most rational choice. The message that echoes beyond this analysis is simple but profound. You teach people how to treat you through what you accept, and what you accept becomes what you deserve in their eyes and eventually in your own. Every time you smile through disrespect, every time you absorb a slight in the name of being a bigger person, every time you let a boundary violation slide because addressing it seems harder than enduring it, you are actively training the people around you to view you as someone whose boundaries are optional and whose discomfort is acceptable. This training happens regardless of your intentions, regardless of your internal justifications, regardless of how evolved you believe yourself to be for rising above it. The world does not care about your internal narrative, only about the behaviors you demonstrate and the consequences you impose. If you found something in this exploration that resonated with your own experience, something that made you reconsider how you have been responding to disrespect, or made you recognize patterns you have been ignoring, then I invite you to engage with this content in ways that allow it to reach others who might benefit from the same insights. A like tells the algorithm that this perspective has value. A comment shares your own experiences with enforcing boundaries or the costs of failing to do so. A subscription ensures you continue receiving analyses that challenge comfortable assumptions. And a share extends these ideas to people in your network who may need to hear them. These actions cost you nothing, but create ripples that extend far beyond this single conversation. And in a world that increasingly pressures people to accept disrespect in the name of tolerance or emotional intelligence, perspectives that remind us of the value of boundaries and consequences serve a function that extends beyond entertainment into genuine utility.